Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Quantum Astrology Gathering. With me today, it's my real great pleasure to have Mark Jones. Mark Jones is a globally recognized astrologer, teacher, and consultant. He's authored key books, including Healing the Soul, Pluto, Uranus, and the Lunar Nodes, and The Soul Speaks, The Therapeutic Potential of Astrology. These works blend his extensive knowledge of astrology with his experience as a transpersonal psychotherapist, emphasizing the transformative potential of astrology. His latest book, Planetary Nodes and Collective Evolution, explores the potential of astrology to perceive archetypal and collective meaning, both in world events and individual lives. And the rest of the bio will be in the description, but it's the Planetary Nodes book. I mean, I've got your other books as well, Mark, but I just love that Planetary Nodes book, and that's what kind of drew me to you even more. So that's why we're here, really, isn't it? So
Well, it's
thank you
great.
for.
I'm really glad you enjoyed it because it was a lot of research went into that, and that's when I really started working full time with my current collaborator, friend and independent astrologer, Patrick Graham, who creates the slides for these presentations and that I do all the prep work with. But for the planetary node material, there was just such a huge amount of research involved. We literally looked at thousands of charts, and we've amassed this incredible chart database, which allows us to look into certain patterns. I mean, I won't be focusing on that today, really, Louise. I'm going to just do a relatively simple presentation trying to articulate one kind of perspective view on how we could think about astrology in relationship to, in a sense, without sounding too pretentious, the history of thought. But the planetary node work that you appreciated so much, I mean, so much research went into it. We were literally mapping world historical charts, and shout out to Nick Campion for that fantastic book of world horoscopes from the Roman times to now. We've got material on that we still haven't shared. We've got enough material research-wise for another book. But I'll be frank,
Mhm.
Louise, it's a specialist subject, isn't it? It's not like, in terms of my development as an astrologer, it reaches a lot more people for me to put out material about how to be an effective astrologer or how
Oh,
to utilize more conventional astrological techniques. It's so specialized. And yet, the things we've already uncovered, even since the book, even as the book was being published, we were tracking the events in 2020 and mapping it. So there's all sorts of further material just through history continuing to happen that have in fact proved the validity of that material in a way we haven't even shared yet. I mean,
I
just
know.
out of interest, not to, earmark terrible historical suffering as a sign of astrology, but the book makes the case that the geocentric nodes are super important and awkward though it is. So on top of that point, Louise, about, staying with more beginner type material or intermediate material, the planetary nodes is already specialized. And then I alienated a chunk of the planetary node community by not just using the simpler heliocentric positions, which stay the same. I made a case for the importance of geocentric, which complicated the matter even further. And yet we saw, with the Russia invasion of Ukraine, that the geocentric nodes, because of the fluctuation it happening in February and early part of the year, the geocentric node of Saturn had pushed out to 27 degrees, a point it would never get to. The heliocentric is several degrees further back into Capricorn than that. And of course, Pluto was transiting exactly on that point, showing the effectiveness of the geocentric nodal fluctuations during the pattern of the Earth's movement in the year because we're on planet Earth. The
Mhm.
relevance of that seemed too important to ignore, even though it made the thesis ever more challengingly complex. So there you go.
Oh,
Sometimes, Louise, it's not
I
simple, is it, this world? Yeah.
It isn't, and I get that completely. Just one thing before I let you dive into your presentation. We're recording this on the day that Mercury's stationing retrograde at 22 Sagittarius, and the Cazimi in the middle of the retrograde on December the 5th is exactly on the geocentric south node of Uranus and opposing where the Venus star point was on June the 4th on the north node of Uranus, which is back at 14 degrees. So
Very interesting.
when people hear this, they'll see if anything kind of really radically shifted around December the 5th, right, 2024.
I mean, I do think, Louise, and I think you're an early forerunner of this, and in our
Mm,
previous conversation, we talked about this, that the planetary nodes will become a part of certain types of astrologers' arsenal, if you like, or quiver of arrows of possible techniques, because in terms of exploring historical intersections of meaning in an obviously extraordinarily complex world, and I could do a whole presentation just on the complexity problem in astrology, and I might raise it at a couple of points today, but they are so good at this kind of strange feeling that maybe there is every now and then this feeling of a strange architecture or scaffolding subtly behind reality, and that larger themes, just like the feeling that the world has right now, that some bigger change is going on, whether it's just political changes in an individual country or the feeling of the rise of technology. But we're also entering a period, aren't we, where all three outer planets in the next 18 months, Pluto just a week or two ago, and the rest are joining, will all change sign within a year or 18 months of each other. And people have that feeling of deeper shifts in the collective culture or the civilization itself. I do think there is a level to which astrology is very interesting for themic or symbolic exploration of that reality.
I agree.
Well, yeah, let
But
me,
I
yes.
just wanted to encourage people to explore your book if they feel called. Definitely not for a beginner, yeah.
But it does, I think, at least to be fair to it, it gives you all the research in it. You don't have to know anything about planetary nodes beforehand. It lays
Mm,
out their positions, it lays out a potential thesis. Now, for those who are interested in it, they could balk at me and say, Mark, you didn't clearly delineate a total meaning for all of these positions. Well, the book was written as an invitation to the astrological community, really, to pick them up. The idea that I could just come up with a total clear meaning for positions of such complexity involving the evolution of planetary archetypes themselves over centuries or millennia would have, I think, been too hubristic. But it's certainly suggestive of potential meanings. And I've done further work. After the book, I taught a lot of classes in China, strangely. We're very interested in that planetary node material, schools in China. And I've developed a lot more material since, so maybe I get another chance to share that in a different area.
and I
To,
think as a community, we discover the meaning ourselves over time. So it's yeah. You, I think you were right not to make a cookbook meaning at this point.
I just couldn't, could I, in all integrity? I do actually care about the truth on some level, and the face that history does not have simple answers, doesn't it? We see that history is such an important study, but any study of history does not just produce simple answers. There isn't just a simple plot line to history, and there isn't just simply a kind of moral guiding force or sense that the good guys win, like in certain movies or something, or even that necessarily the bad guys win, like certain other movies, but that there aren't simple lessons, but there are profound lessons in history that we need to look at. Um,
Yeah,
Today, I'm going to look at really an idea, one central idea I'm going to try and present today, which is a kind of understanding of astrology in a pre-rational sense, a rational sense, and a potentially post-rational or transpersonal sense. Let me try and explain what I mean. In my view, in modernity, astrology is criticized, and most of the criticism is on this kind of pre-rational, 2001 Space Odyssey, dawn of civilization. We don't know, we don't understand the cosmos we're in. We're literally in the dark as soon as the sun goes down. As it's going down here, there aren't normally the electric lights. And we look up to the starry heavens. And in gazing up at this blazing heavenly spheres, we're suddenly communicating with them, trying to find answers, drawing animal forms onto them, seeing the constellations, etc. And it's all a kind of magical thinking, if you like, designed by a sort of the view of the scientific deconstruction of this, a primitive peoples who don't have modern scientific explanations. Now, the scientist Michel Gauquelin, who actually studied astrology, attempting to disprove it, and then found that it did have statistical validity, which we'll talk about him again in the rational section. In his excellent book Cosmic Clocks, now remember he's started as a criticizer of astrology, a critic, and he's come round and sees that, I mean, what a claim. Astrology was at the same time the first religion and the first science that man developed. So there are clearly counter voices, and I would pick out someone like Owen Barfield, the friend of C.S. Lewis and Tolkien's, who, he argued that the way we view primitive people being absorbed, and now we've become so much more metaphorical and clever, we may have actually left something behind. His great example in the stunningly subtle book, Saving the Appearances, is the Greek word pneuma for spirit that also means wind or breath. And there's an argument that, we have made spirit metaphorical, or we've understood now, because we're much more complex, rational creatures, the way metaphor works. And Barfield argues differently and says maybe we've lost something. Maybe to that people, spirit was so powerful that when you experienced it, it literally blew you over, or it literally blew through your world in this way where it was completely immersive, and actually referring the same word to, pneuma, spirit, breath, or psyche, butterfly, that these concepts were because earlier peoples had this much more visceral, immersive experience of these realities, what he called a participation or an original participation that we have since self-consciously been thrown out of. But let's look at this self-conscious throwing out, if you like, right? And I think it's really important to understand this, because all of us that are interested in astrology, we face this effectively critique of the culture or civilization. Even if we're not personally affected by it, we're collectively affected by it. You could make all sorts of subtle arguments that astrology itself, is on the back foot, or has been in large parts of the 20th century, culturally on the back foot, even persecuted, that astrologers feel the need to justify themselves and what they're doing, all because of this critique. Now, there is one real central point to grasp in this critique, and I'll try and make it in a number of different ways, right? The critique of astrology critiques supernatural causation generally. It's a denial of the mythic or the divine. The gods, in this sense, are seen as explanatory powers that we now have a better explanation for. So notice it's entirely reductive from the beginning. This is what's known as the God of the gaps, right? The God only exists because we have a gap in our scientific knowledge. And because of this gap, we have to attribute thunderstorms and lightning to Thor, or we have to attribute the flooding of a river, a theme all across the UK today, flooding, and yesterday here in Wales, to angry river gods. And because we now understand the water cycle, because we now understand, river management or maintenance or science, we don't need these gods anymore. So we strip the mythic world of its power in that sense. You get a hint of that, Tolkien saying the elves are leaving Middle-earth or something. There is a sense I have, are we throwing the baby out with the bathwater? Have we lost a certain primal response to the presence of reality, the presence of nature, our involvement in the cosmos, by dismissing with our intellectual vanity the entire process that we attributed mythic power to? But I want to underline what I think is one key fallacy. Part of this Enlightenment critique of the mythic worldview or the astrological worldview is that once you've explained the gap, there's no need for the God. And this is a point Dawkins makes, the great critique of religion. And, does Dawkins have a point that religion has led to many wars, many prejudicial forms of thought, many problems for the human experience? Sure. But the fallacy here is that you can just pick out this, we didn't know the causation of things and we gave it to a god to explain it. And now we have explained it, we don't need that god anymore. The reductiveness of that argument I'm going to point out in a number of ways. So it's a bit like Dawkins picking out some, forgive me for the cliche and no disrespect for the people of Alabama, but some good old boy in Alabama who thinks that, the earth is only a few thousand years old because they've counted up the ages of the people in the Old Testament, etc. They don't believe in dinosaurs. And because we've shown that not to be true, there's no God. I mean, that's an unbelievably reductive argument. The idea that the entire mystery of the divine through the ages, the cathedral culture, the great religious cultures of India, the Rig Vedas, Buddhism, can all just be dismissed because now we have a better explanation, is an unbelievably reductive argument. And to be fair to those people who've pointed this out, someone like Rupert Sheldrake, the Christian biologist who wrote a much more open-minded book than The God Delusion, The Science Delusion, a subject of which I think it's the most popular ever banned TED Talk, where he really tried to show what science has done, but then, to be fair, also showed all the things that science can't address and doesn't even really try to. Um, you know, it's not really trying to answer why, it's not trying to answer what's before the Big Bang, etc. So we can see that people have picked up on this God delusion idea and questioned it back. Because in a sense, what Dawkins and others have used, and I think it's a shadow of the Enlightenment and it's applied to astrology, is what we could call a straw man argument, where you misrepresent the other person's position to such a ludicrously flimsy level that it can be easily defeated. But what's the point of doing that, people, other than winning a points battle, or if you're involved in some sort of political race, race for the prize? Why would you do that? It's just literally making the world more simplistic so you can dismiss it. What we're really looking for is the steelman argument. Like, the more respectful argument is to actually work out what the strength of any given position is, and then still make an argument for one's own position. Just like Sheldrake in his book does not deny the power of science and is himself a scientist and celebrates many of the achievements of science in the book. He's just not afraid to go to what science also hasn't done. So this is more of a steelman argument. We've got to understand that the primary intellectual critique of our time against the position of astrology was a straw man argument. That we explained the god of the gaps and then said we didn't need the gods anymore. We didn't need Mars and Venus and Jupiter and Saturn. And yet it's a false construct. That was just one expression, a partial expression of one period of time's worldview about those planetary positions. It also doesn't respect this incredible quality of original participation that Barfield argues so passionately was a psychic reality for earlier formations of humanity. So there's no respect for the immersive power of relating to nature in that way. Then nature is seen as being caricatured through these different archetypes, Mars, Venus, Mercury, Jupiter, Saturn, and then it's deconstructed because we don't need those anymore, because we've understood the structure of reality in a different way and we don't need these absurd, flimsy caricatures anymore. Well, picture the person dismissing Christianity because you dismiss someone who doesn't believe in dinosaurs and just thinks the world is 6,000 years old, like Bishop Ussher said it was because he counted up all the age of the patriarchs in the Bible. It's a steel failure and a straw man fire. It's a bonfire of the vanities. It did not respect the cultural origins that it critiques. What is rational astrology? So I'm going to present pre-rational astrology, rational astrology, and try and imagine a post-rational astrology.
One of my favorite people.
Yes, he's truly, he's an amazing choice actually of my researcher here to pick for a symbol of the rational, is it? The man who came up with these movies, which are truly and not the most rational things to follow. Um, so the scientific worldview. So I want to do two things in this section. I want to show the triumph of the rational view and its limitations, and then the way it contextualized astrology, and then some threads or responses to that from people who've done something different. The scientific delusion was obviously Sheldrake's title. And, we're not trying to say, just as Sheldrake doesn't try to say, that all of the scientific view is bunkum, but it certainly has some limitations. And let me try and present those limitations to you. In a lecture in Bristol with the multiverse physicist Brian Greene, I, eager beaver in the crowd, yes, I have a question. What about before the Big Bang? Oh, no, we don't even look at that, Brian Greene openly admitted, as if sensing the spiritual or meaning orientated vacuum that would leave. So, everything is this incredibly explosion, 14 billion years ago, these incredible powers going on, this strange balance between actual matter and antimatter and dark matter, and the complexities of string theory, multiverse theory, and contemporary quantum physics would reveal, if we looked into them, that there is just as much disagreement in those territories as there is within the different interpretive approaches of astrology, frankly. The idea that of the Big Bang that emerged in the middle 20th century, really, with any degree of consistency, has totally explained our origin story, is beyond naive. The idea that the Big Bang as an origin story has provided a sense of wholesome, nutritious meaning that people living their lives can rely on is again absurd. What has this done for us? It's not implausible. People have listened using radio telescopes to the background noise of the Big Bang. It's a plausible explanation for a variety of phenomena. Is it the answer to everything? I doubt it. Then we have the move from the realm of physics to the realm of biology and the classical Darwinian position. And if we're following Dawkins' work, this is where we go back to the selfish gene, and everything is described through a process of survival of the fittest over time, leading to adaptation in complex environments. Now, I am not an expert enough to know the ins and outs of this, but I do know that not just religious thinking scientists have questioned the exact hardline Darwinian stance in recent years. Many Christian scientists have, of course, critiqued it profoundly. But I'll just say one popular phrase that hasn't been completely dismissed from several areas of complex evolution over time: the missing link. The fact that there are these significant missing links, the fact that there are these kind of explosion periods of creativity where multiple species proliferate in complex environments compared to long periods where very little happens at all. These are not understood processes in some complete or full way. And then the Darwinian biological understanding does not explain why there is life, fundamentally, or the original spark. Biology cannot answer the complexity of human life, the origin of the human fetus, the mystery of the brain. We're not only recently has there been a paradigm shift in measuring brain waves from electromagnetic frequencies to more complex field phenomena going on complexly on a quantum level within brain processes, which of course is being emulated in quantum computing, which again use field processes rather than just binary computation. So again, I put it to you, Darwin's ideas are interesting. They are valid to some extent. They are not meaningless. The idea that they explain why or how there is life is, again, in my view, incredibly reductionist, bordering on incredibly naive. And then perhaps we reach the epitome or nadir of this kind of approach in the world of chemistry, where the very spark of your consciousness, the very hopes and dreams that you have, the love you have for the creation, for people in your life, your creativity, your dreams, are epiphenomena created by accidental organic processes in the brain, sort of just firing off randomly and making weird connections, and that's it. And there is a whole field of consciousness studies exploring this in this most microscopic of details. The materialist paradigm through the sciences is, I would argue, disappointing generally, but at this point it reaches peak disappointment. The idea that the human soul is reduced to accidental epiphenomena, just the brain soup in its organic reactions to other organic processes, is mind-blowingly disappointing. And in fact, you could argue, couldn't you, and I perhaps am, that these three together, physics and the Big Bang, Darwin and biology, consciousness as an epiphenomena in chemistry, lead to effectively a nihilistic worldview. That scientific materialism in this sense does not have sufficient meaning to form a basis to live your life. And the rational intellectual elite wonder why so many people are turning to things like astrology or divinatory forms or deeper archetypal psychic patterns of meaning. So I am making the argument from the most trivial level, to the most cosmic, that science hasn't explained everything. In fact, far from it. And then even if you think it has, much more than a skeptic like me, the idea that science is telling you crucial answers to your meaning questions, to the issue of existential truth, moral truth, the experiential reality of being a human psyche in this world is, again, where is the succor? Where is the food? Where is the nutritional content about how to live your life? So we see in the work of Dane Rudhyar a kind of paternal figure in the growth of modern psychological and spiritual astrology. This at least partial recognition of the rational dilemma. Right? And I think it's important that we take a moment over this complex statement of his, right, or complex series of statements. And I'm just going to read this first line together just so that we take it in. Astrology is a particularly fertile field for the growth of unsubstantiated personal opinions based on the astrologer's unavoidably limited experience. Phenomenal. I mean, I think a genius critique of astrology. If we're going to critique, or I'm critiquing science or the rational philosophy of the Enlightenment, at least partially in this talk, we've got to also be open to astrological critique, which is, people forming ideas based on what? Maybe they've done, let's be optimistic and say they're pretty experienced. They've done 500 readings. And the thing they're doing a talk or presentation on has shown up in 10 or 15 clients' charts in some form or another, but they might not remember 5 or 6 of those. They're probably down to 10 or less for the particular signature they're telling you about in a talk from their limited client experience, which based on their age, gender, ethnicity, approach, has only attracted certain types of people to them to do the readings. So unbelievably limited data sets becoming the basis for incredible pronouncements as to astrological efficacy. Either that or no data set at all, an over literal interpretation. So an example of this, someone forwarded me just 2 days ago, someone writing about Jupiter in detriment, Jupiter retrograde or in detriment in Gemini or Virgo or some sort of signature like that, saying that all people with that placement had some sort of struggle with their vision or faith, or even their moral sense of the truth, literalizing a retrograde planet and saying you have no ability to express it. Here we are going into a Mercury retrograde, but, you know, I think there's some degree of mental clarity still possible. So to sort of cut through this taking of personal experience, you remember astrology was a fringe profession for a long time. People did just a small number of readings, and then they're going out into the lecture circuit with subjects based on those readings or their thoughts about astrology, not necessarily tested across large population masses, because how would they even get hold of the data to test it? So Rudyard recognizes this very acutely and points towards a trend towards statistical and critical analysis, more scientific, larger data sets. Now, I clearly think this is important, hence working with the researcher for the planetary node material that we were discussing and amassing thousands of charts. However, Roger, never a simple thinker, does not think this represents the total answer either, because it has the germ of misapplication in it, he says. Facts can be used to destroy the integrity of the human person, even if they're correct. Facts may utterly confuse. They may kill something in someone, as well as heal or make whole. And then let's just check out this absolutely crucial phrase. Facts have no value except in relation to the consciousness which perceives them. This is crucial. You know, you could look at this from a variety of different perspectives. You could say, even if you were a genius astrologer and someone came to you for a reading, is it helpful to them to share a particular insight you've had? Would it be kind? Would it be useful to them at that particular stage of their development? Is it particularly helpful to say to a person in their 20s that you see this, you know, one phenomenal time their chart breaks through occurring when they're 57? Does that really help them? So we have this enormously complex sense that, yes, increasing data sets, yes, bringing some sort of statistical observational clarity to the processes of astrology must surely be helpful, but it's not the sole answer. I think his material here, and I think most of this is from a pamphlet that's available on Chaldea, or at least most of it is, called From Humanistic to Transpersonal Astrology, is a work of genius, and it raises many key issues in our profession that still, to my knowledge, have not been effectively truly addressed. But to continue this rational approach, right, he has made this point that some degree of statistical analysis is important. Well, we come back to Michel Gauquelin, who I was talking about earlier. So Gauquelin and his wife approached astrology with complex statistical testing. You know, they were scientific grade, mathematical grade, statistical analyzers, and they approached astrology with an initially dismissive scientific derision, and were going to use their statistical processes to sort of disprove it once and for all. Then, of course, they discovered that astrology did have statistical validity and valid, you know, that it was beyond a statistical mean in terms of its validity. And of course, this leapt out at them, and they were sufficiently intellectually honest that they wrote about it. And in fact, they discovered what has been since called the Gauquelin zone. They discovered these key points in the chart most pronouncedly around the ascendant, particularly on the 12th house side of the ascendant, and around the midheaven, but particularly the 9th house side of the midheaven, as being these incredibly heightened zones where planetary activity there would have greater influence. They then attributed that initially, it was called the Mars effect. It's Googleable as the Mars effect by the Gauquelins, because they would find Mars in these positions in a more than statistically relevant bunch of sports people. We've chosen the example here from his lesser well-known work on the moon and writers. Strangely, he did not find Mercury in these zones for writers, but the moon, the expression of the personal vision, feelings, the kind of sense of wanting to process one's own biography or emotional felt sense of the world through writing. And I'm just going to offer some examples, because this is a kind of pinnacle, if you like. And Gauquelin did this with Jupiter with actors, all sorts of other phenomena. It's an incredible amount of work out there. I'd also note that myself, I've done work and taught this in schools in Beijing, whereby we looked at Mercury placements conjunct planetary nodes and found a correspondence with writers that had had a big impact around the themes that their Mercury on that planetary node revealed. And, hopefully I'll get a chance to share that in a different form sometime. But just to give you some examples of this, and this is him setting out that same data set in a different form, he looked at 1,352 writers for their distribution of their moon placements. So again, the Gokalan's data sets is not perfect. There are billions of people on the planet, but hitting a data set for just one analysis, above 1,300 is better than the average astrologer on their own, just picking from the client examples that they can remember for readings they've done. We see Allen Ginsberg. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness. Moon in Pisces in the 12th. His kind of poetic, mystical, psychedelically saturated response to the issues of the late 60s. We see Barbara Cartland, Moon just on the ascendant, on the edge of the Gokalan zone, who just produced endless books on romantic love. I love this quote: "Forever is a very long time, but true love lasts even longer." Thank you, Barbara, for that pink, loving vision. We have the classic example, and now Proust's moon is just about on the edge of the Gokalan. My researcher doesn't always want to include this, but I just think it's so perfect because his entire oeuvre, and look at all those planets in Cancer in the 4th and the North Node in Cancer too, his entire life's work, this 12 volume, In Search of Lost Time, is about, childhood memories brought about by eating a Madeleine cake whilst drinking tea, and going back to this character's childhood, Swan's childhood, and the whole way it weaves into his life. The whole thing is a meditation. Proust spent his life writing about a fictionalized other life in its entirety. D.H. Lawrence with Moon and Venus in Libra in the Gokalan zone, Sons and Lovers, the Rainbow. Lawrence is known for his effectively like Oedipal, like this closeness to his mother that came through his novels, and the emotional power that came about as a result. And then we have the example here with Agatha Christie of the moon in the 9th house in the Gokalan zone. A writer who still is one of the most read novelists in the world today. So I wanted to illustrate, and we actually have about 30 of these examples, that just a cursory look at the works of writers can show you the efficacy of Gokalan's insights. We're talking about properly, rationally researched astrology with considerable examples. So Gokalan, ironically, the Gokalans become this epitome or embodiment of a truly rational analytical astrology, having tried to destroy it on that level. I want to ask the question or explore the idea here as part of our quantum astrological thinking. Is there a pre-science astrology, the straw man, the god of the gaps that was explained, and now we should all be over our superstition, and the kind of things that Stephen Fry, an otherwise, quite lovely gentleman with very clever man, says about astrology? These distant constellations in the sky don't even occur in the way that they're described. And he is, of course, correct. Everything that he says in his critique is correct. It's just a misunderstanding of the archetypal terrain, that it doesn't have to literally make sense for it to be potentially interesting symbolically or archetypically in the way you live your life. So what is a post-rational, or what is a post-science astrology? Well, I could spend a week-long workshop from this point. So I'm going to say a number of just initial things. I'm going to bring us back to Dane Rudhyar, who clearly, in From Humanistic to Transpersonal Astrology, is laying out a vision of what a transpersonal astrologer would be. Someone not merely able to transmit a celestial message, but to translate the cosmic or archetypal into the existential. What does he mean by that? To collapse the wave function back into people's lives. Not to talk about abstract archetypal symbolism, but to actually relate it to the psychological, emotional, and transformational concerns of the humans that you work with. So he's pointing to this whole idea of the chart as a map of meaning. And I would argue the whole point then of being an astrologer is to turn the map of meaning. Once you've understood the map, you have to study to the point that you have symbolic insight about the nature of the map. And then the whole process becomes, how do you share it in the most relevant and profound way, in a way that will actually give something to people's lives. This, by the way, is from the archive of Roberto Assagioli, the founder of psychosynthesis. This is his hand-drawn attempt to bring about insights of certain charts. I believe this is an attempt to draw Sigmund Freud's chart. We now have a more accurate time when we would actually see that Freud's chart does not line up exactly in this way. The houses are not correct, but notice Assagioli's drawn on that Mars position in the relationship to the rest of the chart, which so many other astrologers have commented on in the sex-obsessed Freud. Now, why am I talking about Roberto Assagioli in the archive? Well, Assagioli was a friend of Dane Rudhyar's. Dane Rudhyar visited Assagioli soon after the publication of Astrology of Personality in 1936. On his way to visit his wife, who was traveling in India, Rudhyar stays in Florence with Assagioli. And we have this interesting point. So this is all uncovered from an archive that was effectively hidden from the world. So Assagioli died in 1974. His papers are put away. They're stored initially in an attic room in his office and home in Florence. Then there's a leak. Rain comes in the roof and they're all moved to a basement for safety. And then not until what I suspect the noughties, they are uncovered by visiting writers and brought out. And so begins an archival reconstruction project to bring about this material back into the public knowledge. And as I was presented, as Paola showed my colleague and I around this archive, she stopped at one point and said, this might be particularly interesting to you, right on the beginning of the first day, and actually pointed at me. And she pointed me to a second room in the archive, because there were so many people there at this special sort of 20 people invite only event in 2012, where we were fortunate to be there, my colleague and I. And she pointed us to a second room with a pile of box files saying spiritual astrology in English. That's what the ENG means, i.e., a schmuck like me that only speaks and reads English has a chance of making sense of it. So we're shown that this transpersonal psychologist, Italian doctor, teenage student of Freud, contemporary of Jung's at the Boccalzi Clinic, was an astrologer, not just dabbling, but with enormous material. And that Dane Rudhyar and so Rudhyar visits him in Florence in 36, 37. Rudhyar claims at this point to have read the entire output of Carl Jung's works. And then he's hanging out with Assagioli. This is me in the archive. 2012, looking at a timeline that Assagioli's drawn of the history of ideas, placing it against astrological timings. His detailed notes on psychology and astrology that my colleague and I were able to spend days going through. And you realize that here in the melting pot of the 20th century, you have this sort of father, for want of a better phrase, of modern astrology, or this huge, pioneering figure in Dane Rudhyar, having read the entire works of Carl Jung to that point, hanging out with Assagioli, discussing astrology and psychology with him. Assagioli forms the first truly spiritual vision of psychology that's existed in the world, unless you accept that Jung was always a spiritual psychologist. But by Jung's own words, he wasn't. You could argue he profoundly became one. But Assagioli creates this explicitly spiritual vision of astrology here in this office. Here's his desk. This figure that produced this initial rewrite of psychology, his famous phrase that Freud was brilliant, but Freud only focused on the basement. And what about the rest of the building? His attempt to say that Freud was being too reductionist and not looking at higher human potentials was shaped by this astrological vision, just as we now know through, initially the work of Maggie Hyde in the 80s and now the work of Liz Green, that Jung was also a very serious student of astrology. Although on the basis of I've had 3 trips to this archive now, and seeing just how many hand-drawn charts Assagioli had, I think he's more of an astrologer than Jung in terms of actually just spending a long time hand creating charts and using them in his client work. So we're looking at this very interesting period in the middle of the 20th century that's all about to be shut down. Freud has to leave Venice via Paris, and hence we've got that wonderful Freud museum in his house in London. Because of the war, because of the anti-Semitism directed at him, Assagioli is imprisoned and placed in solitary confinement. His family villa is burned down. He's on the run. Mussolini sees psychosynthesis as a dangerous pacifist organization that has to be shut down. Jung escapes, of course, in neutral Switzerland, which has seen some people critique Jung's position during the war, although there is at least one theory now. Was it in the biography by Barbara Hanna, where Jung is actually working for Allied intelligence during the war as he maintains his membership of various psychoanalytical societies. But this tentative frisson of these great minds exploring both psychology and astrology together at the middle of the 20th century gets shut down by the rise of totalitarianism in Europe and the Second World War. That's the kind of flowering but tragic cutting down of that possibility. I'm interested in that possibility again. Now, Assagioli has been shaped, we discovered in our last trip to the archive. This is from my colleague Keith Hackwood, who I teach a psychosynthesis coaching training with. Keith was giving a talk at the archive and therefore was part of the staff and therefore was allowed to go into this room where the locked contents of Assagioli's desk had been revealed. Something I asked about in 2012 and was told the desk had never been opened. Something I knew at the time wasn't true. You don't have a desk since 1974 and never find a locksmith to open it. Inside his locked desk was this hand-bound leather journal, this print from Alan Leo, which is a kind of life reading that Assagioli had in his mid-20s that he used to read every year and reflect on and have a relationship. So we see this complex relationship between the theosophical astrologer Alan Leo, ironically and tragically a persecuted man in his own country, having this influence on this Italian doctor and psychiatrist who himself was reimagining the nature of psychology, perhaps using the complex sense of a world infused with meaning that astrology gave him in order to reimagine psychology like that. So we see this incredible frisson of all these different influences, theosophy, early modern psychology, spirituality, astrology, all coming together for this incredibly vibrant time, but one that tragically is shut down. So the very person that sent to Assagioli this book was the last astrologer to be convicted under the 1735 Witchcraft Act, even though Alan Leo was open in his attempt to go past predictive techniques and actually engage in a more psychologically fluent astrology. He was still, as fate would have it, persecuted for fortune telling. And the kind of breakdown that produced in him was surely a stress factor contribution to his early death of some kind of brain hemorrhage. You have Roberto Assagioli on the left, the recipient of this reading from Alan Leo in his 20s, founder of this spiritual psychology, friend of Jung's, who Rudyard has also just devoured the written output, which is quite considerable by the mid 1930s. And Jung's not an easy person to read. You get these two men hanging out in Florence. Assagioli has his home and office there. The family have a villa out in the hills. That villa is destroyed. All of Assagioli's papers in it are destroyed by Mussolini. All of it's shut down by these tragic interventions. Assagioli goes on the run in the northern Italian mountains with his wife and child. His son, a fragile, constitutionally young man, contracts tuberculosis of the bone that he will eventually die from, only in his around 27, age 27. So the war has this tremendous cost on this sort of vibrant coming together of these minds, of these psyches, of these hearts, trying to imagine this fusion of transpersonal meaning, psychology, and astrology. But it was there. It was going on. I feel it's my purpose, it's my duty, it's my response to the meaning of this that I try and share and talk about this. Now, I think the falling out in a way between these two, there's a very poignant letter from Assagioli asking for Jung for help after the war to see a Swiss doctor for his ailing son. I have no idea about the reply. I don't know if these letters are even kept or where you would find them, but I saw at least a copy of the letter that Assagioli sent Jung in that archive. Now, why weren't these men closer in some ways? I think Jung understands that the theosophical influence on Assagioli, Assagioli's linked to Alice Bailey and teachings she was doing, and Assagioli is one of her named figures in discipleship for the New Age. He is the character FCD in those two volumes. That's part of her inner group. Jung doesn't like theosophy. He doesn't want the cosmic map. He doesn't want master so and so running this, running that. Jung wants to encounter the psyche in its raw form in his own work, as made famous by the recent publication of the Red Book, which is an extraordinary tome, like a modern genuine spell book. So you have these complex divisions, but these two figures that effectively dreamed up modern, meaning-orientated, spiritually orientated psychology and psychotherapy were both immersed in astrology. Assagioli throughout his life, Jung, who did his thesis on various psychic phenomena on and off in his early years, and then has this profound period in his midlife transition where he's studying astrology to the extent that he apologizes for being unable to reply to the Nobel Prize-winning physicist Wolfgang Pauli because he's too busy studying astrology and synchronicity. So these men are immersed on a very serious level in the study of astrology, and that bringing back of that mythic power, that bringing back of that original participation, I am arguing helps them imagine a more modern turning towards meaning within the world of psychology, going beyond Freud's more mechanistic limitations. So we see Roger talking about this kind of quality of being. So what is a post-rational astrology? It's one in which the chart symbolizes a true nature, or what he calls the true name. That you have a true being, that you have a soul, if you like, and that the chart is a symbolic construct. It's a kind of poem doorway that could help you open to that realm of your soul, and that you could potentially, through your contemplation of that chart, through your life, have a relationship to the wholeness and inner essence that's possible for a human being, which sadly many humans, most humans, don't get to or fall short, or life failures or tragedies accumulate, or trauma. you know, he's saying, could astrology be the great gift that helps you overcome the partial nature of your life, the fragmentary, incomplete, or unfulfilled aspect of your life, and show you, in a sense, like a treasure map, a kind of guiding vision towards these unrealized parts of yourself that are there, archetypally true. I think that's an incredibly powerful thing to say. He continues in a different source. The human is what he is because that is what is needed at that time. The birth chart represents the solution of the need. Effectively, he's saying your birth chart shows you how to be what, if you weren't there, would be the U-shaped hole in the universe. And therefore, the birth chart contains a kind of signature. It contains the potential for your sacred name. It refers, therefore, to this degree of purpose which very few other things could touch. So actually, what's implicit in that worldview that simplistic straw man scientific arguments have denied, what's implicit, if you looked at it in a sort of recognizing the value of science, but recognizing that the value of science is only an intellectual value, and that the mind can only intellectually label reality up to a certain point, and a transcendent dimension of reality exists beyond the capacity of the mind to label it as a real presence in reality, that astrology might be a symbolic way of engaging with that real presence and activating this kind of signature which would help you reveal your true being or total being, your wholeness or your essential nature. So we are looking here where astrology could actually be not just not failed because we've explained the God of the gaps and we don't need it anymore, but actually revealing the very thing that was lost all along, the inner treasure, that it's a symbolic map, the birth chart, for you to come back to yourself and your true nature. And this is his point about the limitation of statistical processes or the rational approach to astrology, which we do need to stabilize the potential for astrology, remember, to become unsubstantiated personal opinion based on the very limited experience of the astrologer. But that astrology also points to a mystery where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. You can't just break down a chart and go, Venus in Gemini equals Saturn in Virgo equals Mercury in Aquarius equals. You have to grasp intuitively a whole. It's relating to a being, the human whose chart it is. And you must develop your intuition, not just astrologically to synthesize the symbols, but to synthesize the symbols in a way that speaks to living human beings who are the real recipients of the birth chart. People are much more real than birth charts, and birth charts need to help those people be more real, not less real, not imprisoning them through limited or simplistic diagnosis or cookbook blurbs that might apply to 70% of people with Venus in Gemini or Moon in Virgo or something. If Moon in Virgo has a tendency towards self-criticism, let's say, maybe 6 out of 10 Moon in Virgos do in a more pronounced way. Maybe a couple don't, and it just takes a different form. Who knows? What we're saying is there has to be a flexibility of thinking about the range of the archetypes so that you can position it with each individual you're working with, so that you can gain an holistic overview of both them as a person and the nature of their chart. And Roger points to this in lots of his late work. I want to remind us, in the origins of Western culture, there was a soul vision, there was a reincarnational vision, that Socrates, the star of Plato, and of course, many people have called Western philosophy a series of footnotes to Plato. Now, whether that's totally accurate or not, it certainly shows you what a huge figure Plato is and has been. Socrates, the star of Plato's dialogues, discusses the soul. We can state as universal principles that for a human being, everything else depends on the soul, and that the faculties of the soul itself depend on the knowledge for their goodness. And it follows from that, what does us good is knowledge. that when we're talking about knowledge in the original sense of Western civilization, we're talking about a soul knowledge, not a little broken down intellectual tidbits, micro-analyzed forms. We're talking about an holistic, wisdom-orientated understanding. So I would argue, just as a concluding thought here, and I think it's not just I think, it just is utterly implied in Rudyard's late thought, particularly that 1971 Lunar and Planetary Nodes pamphlet that he wrote for the Theosophical Society that I used as the basis for research in the planetary nodes and collective evolution. He's completely explicit that astrology is inherently spiritual in its origin vision, that the sun is the symbol of the spiritual self, and the earth traveling around it is the symbol of the little personal self growing in life in regard to this higher, deeper meaning. And that journey in life is the ecliptic, the journey of the earth around the sun. And the ecliptic is where you find all the astrological signs and forms the basis of astrology. So the whole basis of astrology is the growth of the small self through its series of cosmic portals and initiations towards a greater life. And then look here, if you go to Assagioli's work, the sun, the self, the higher self, becomes the star at the top of his egg-gram. The earth becomes the little I in your heart, the deep personal self, that's also journeying through life, attempting to grow towards that higher or deeper self potential. So I think what those men shared in the 1930s, and I found in the archive recently, last year, I found in the 1960s, those letters, if you'll forgive me saying this, that Americans tend to write, what they and the family have been up to, and then they send it to maybe 20 or 30 friends or relatives. Rudyard had done one from a writing retreat he was in California over Christmas with all his musings about the nature of the personal and the cosmic Christ. And Assagioli had received a copy. So they were still in close correspondence in the 1960s. And we see that these two men that shared this vision at this most fragile time in the middle of the 20th century, shut down by the forces of fascism almost straight away afterwards, were both contemplating the nature of astrology itself and the nature of the human aura as having this deeper light and then this journeying personal self towards. They were envisaging astrology. They were relying on a coded message from ancient into modern times to help stabilize a psychological and spiritual vision of transcendent human meaning and personal growth. And that is a post-scientific vision of astrology. That is a transpersonal vision of astrology. And I think that's where there's so much richness and so much more to recover even from their kind of work in the middle of the 20th century, and that we could bring into the nature of our troubled times as an inspirational vision of human meaning, which you could argue is so desperately needed in not just a sort of scientifically tired culture of the kind of primitive philosophy, the almost existential despair behind scientific philosophy, but also in a increasingly post-religious Western world, where it's hard to really stabilize any sense of higher meaning. Well, I would argue that astrology and understanding the birth of modern astrology and its relationship to certain spiritual or transpersonal trends within modern psychology does provide a link in modern terms to an ancient mystery tradition of meaning or hermetic path of meaning that astrology has always held a kind of set of spiritual symbols or doorways to help the soul on its journey come back to its own deepest truth. So yeah, I hope that was useful, and blessings to everyone.
That was absolutely mind-blowing. I've got all these notes to go and follow up on, not to ask you questions on. But I do have one question. I write daily astrology updates to try and help people tune into the energies of the day. And I look at a lot of, I listen to a lot of mundane astrologers and other types of astrology. I see this as applying to all of that, like the astrology of a country, for example,
Yes.
events, how we can see it as a map of meaning, as one of the quotes. You agree with that, right? I think that's missing in a lot of that kind of astrology as well.
Well, and I think it's why so many people are turning towards it, aren't they? The danger, this is the pull of the rise of modern astrology and people's need for it. The challenge, I guess, is what? The challenge is that the way you language it and the intention of which you hold these kind of analysis also includes a kind of pointing people back to themselves. Right. If an individual chart, people say things, don't they, about pick any position of anything, sun in such and such, moon in such and such. It's 1 in 12 people, isn't it? There's 8 billion or whatever, that's 700 million people. The idea is going to apply the same in 700 million ways. Well, that problem that we could call the complexity problem is even more real when you try and make generalized statements about the nature of the sky at any given time. But I think there's a way of, because it's a way, it's a kind of creative writing, isn't it? It's a kind of healing fiction, as James Hillman used the phrase for psychotherapy, which is that you could play that astrological game, of which there are consistent rules, and some people are much better at doing it than others, but still also own the uniqueness of the human situation and not just excessively generalized. Now, I understand that people have copy pressures or old magazines where there's a kind of entertainment level or a level in saying like sun sign type astrology, this is going to happen to you, but we all know people who have felt like it was spot on 1 week, 1 month, even life-changingly spot on, and we all know a bunch of people who are completely cynical about it and get turned off by it because a lot of the time it's not going to be spot on. Can we acknowledge that? Can we acknowledge the nature of, I'll use this phrase, I don't mean to be too provocative, the game? Astrology has that. Can we make astrology is partially a fiction on that level. It's not a meaningless fiction. And you could get into arguments about, is there any like fully objective truth in the subjective realm? But can we include always this pointing back to people? I'm not saying it's easy personally. I'm not saying it's easy even in the way I teach people to do readings and stuff, because the danger is, of course, people get so sensitive to some certain kind of counseling dynamic, if you like, that I'm talking about, that they don't feel confident in sharing their real insights. Now, of course, I'm not advocating for that, but I am advocating that this incredible nuance. So, but I mean, you're appealing, Louise, in doing that to this increasing need people have. Now, we've got to own another contentious thing I'm going to say, right? Part of the rise of astrology comes along in a time period when people feel existentially, financially, morally insecure, that there isn't a consistent religion to turn to, science is not offering a vision of higher meaning. So they turn to astrology. What I'm hoping is that we as astrologers make the astrology worthy of that turning, and that we at least include part of shining something back to them. Because no matter what's going on in the sky, some people stay very centered and connected to their deep inner truth. And some other people, no matter how seemingly great everything is outside, are hurting or a mess. And I think those principles have to be held in mind, even as we look for the cosmic narratives or the individual historical country, nation level narratives. I mean, no one is going to argue, are they, that the US Pluto return of the United States had some kind of impact, right? Now, people might disagree as to the nature of it or what was the best outcome to it, but the division implied and the transformative, almost underworld psychic wrestling of a new vision that's implied in that Pluto return has been obvious, hasn't it? Even from outside here in the UK to observe. Yeah.
And I try and convey that in my writing. I do not write to sun signs, that's for
Yes.
sure. I
Yes.
write about just the daily energies and say,
Mm.
how it's evolving and changing, and anyway, it's
Well, because
complex. I
but it is, well, because the complexity problem, if you take it too seriously, you'd never do anything. So I don't want to take it that far. At the same time, the complexity problem is real because, I mean, what is astrology? It's a symbolic picture of space-time moments. I mean, even your own chart isn't exactly your own chart in the way some people think it is. It is just the space-time moment where you happen to come along. So, but I think there's a place for that. I think there's a place for many levels of astrology. And I think this huge surge in the popularity of astrology and its growth that we're seeing, and I think it is that. It's a changed world, in the, say, the 1970s or 1980s, where you could argue it was much harder to get your voice out as an astrologer. Some would, at the heightened peak, a Liz Green or Stephen Araya or something, Sportas. These books were big sellers. They made a big impact. Publishing was real. That's changed, hasn't it? It's become this decentralized network of all these different influences, which you're only going to see increase, I think, under Pluto Aquarius, and especially when Uranus goes into Gemini and trines it in a year and a half. Yeah, there
big
isn't
time.
yeah, because people want these links to narratives of meaning, and they're going to want communities around that too, where they feel more validated in their inward soul yearning to feel a sense of participation in the overriding cosmic flow, for want of a better word. And I think that's genuine. I am not cynical about that at all. I think that's a genuine need, what Jung called the religious function of the psyche. What do we do with
Amazing.
that in a world with no religion and where science is, what's that phrase? We're hurtling along at 10,000 miles an hour for no reason, or third rock from the sun kind of thinking, this kind of materialism of our cosmic situation, because we've become clever enough to see where we are cosmically. We think we're clever enough to understand why. But I would argue they're two separate things. It's a form of hubris to think we've answered the human condition.
Absolutely. One final question, because I know
Yes.
you're Saggioli's works. Are they going to be published? And
Well, so the Psychosynthesis Manual was published in his lifetime. The Act of
oh,
Will was published just as he died, and a collection called Transpersonal Development was published later. I think it's a complex subject, so I'll say a couple of brief things. One, for all his intentions, and you see in the archive all these plans about writing, Assagioli struggled to write, frankly, in a way that Freud didn't. Freud was a brilliant writer, even though you could argue that much of what he actually said was flawed. Jung was profoundly insightful and in many ways not a great writer. I mean, he's not an easy person to read. Assagioli wrote a series of books that are more like collections of essays. It's almost as if he never really surrendered the sort of doctor writing little notes. He had this incredible library, this incredible range of reading. He had the big impact of the Theosophical movement. I think that shut down some of his own writing, perhaps. And of course, he had these very traumatic things happen to him, I think, which made it harder to put all of this together. But with the help of certain students, he put together the short core texts. But I happen to know people personally. I know someone right now writing a book on Assagioli. There's an early Italian book that's recently been translated, an early biography of him. There's also the book by Petra Nocelli, The Way of Psychosynthesis, which details a lot of the stuff that was in the archive, both English and Italian. Obviously, Petra being able to speak and translate Italian in a way that me and my colleague were not able. So there are these resources. But I'll tell you this, Louise, teaching this spiritual, psychosynthesis, psychology, coaching training has just been incredibly rewarding. And to revisit that material and that model of the egg, to realize that Assagioli saw the unconscious as having a higher aspect as well as the stuff you suppress, realizing that effectively you suppress your higher potential just as much as you suppress your shameful memories or struggles from earlier in your life. These are such profoundly liberating ideas. It's such a joy to teach that with people. and to do this work where I'm actually offering trainings for people who are interested in astrology or body work or other things, so that they can actually get genuine therapeutic training alongside the depth of what their other studies have led them to be able to share with people. Because I'm wanting to sort of optimize that mentoring guidance work that astrology can do on that individual and group level to the best of its abilities.
Yeah, and well, please everybody, you know, if you're interested in Mark's work, his website and everything will be in the details. You know, go and look it up. And if I had time right now, I would probably just dive straight into the training, in addition to all the other training I've already done.
Well, and that's and you've got, and there's got to be, that's one of the great things about our studies, isn't it? Is like learning. This subtle question arises for people that study astrology for a long time, because many people study it for a long time, but they don't feel comfortable doing readings. And I would argue that's often to do with the fact that it's not actually about lack of astrological insight at that point. It's really about subconscious concerns and fears about working with people in a guidance, counseling, coaching, mentoring orientated way. And they're feeling, I think, sometimes quite rightly, that they lack a certain experience or sense of how to do that in a grounded way that, you know, guarantees the best results most of the time. I mean, nothing's perfect. But I think sometimes it's a residual insecurity from earlier stages in their life when they weren't supported. And sometimes it's a genuine integrity. Like, I know a lot about astrology, but do I know a lot about helping people? And I think being able to pass the difference between that residual insecurity, am I ready to do this now with people, and work out which part of that is actually genuine and I need to gain some other skill sets in order to be able to do it well, is a very complex and subtle process. And it's often what I help people work out when I do readings or mentoring with people. I'm helping people set themselves up to be able to do their own practice a chunk of the time and feel supported in the right ways to be able to do that.
I kind of think I've got there in different ways.
Yes.
That's why I work with the Organisation for Professional Astrology, and
Yes.
you know, I've done their counselling, and I'm a peer group leader and a mentor. So yeah, amazing.
Well, you have to admire, don't you, Oprah's commitment to that ongoing professional development and support of people, recognizing even a supervisory instinct is quite profound. When I trained as a psychotherapist and qualified in 2002, the next few years of client work, I had inordinate amounts of supervision. I was part of a small supervision group for years afterwards,
Yeah,
where I would just regularly bring client work I was doing to these people, who many of whom were very experienced therapists, led by a therapist who was a Buddhist, committed Buddhist meditator, and we would discuss the issues. So there was so much focus in when I was in my 30s on my development, so much support. Yeah, and it wasn't seen as it wasn't because you were lacking something. You weren't seen as just immature or stupid. It was just a natural part of, you know, it was engaging and creative to talk about one's client work. And I remember one of the people, a man in a wheelchair who'd been a former drug smuggler, an antique smuggler in Southeast Asia, who was now a drugs counselor after his own years as a drug user and smuggler, who was just the most suspicious therapeutic mind I've ever encountered, because he'd spent his whole life as an addict and then working with addicts. All he'd do is go, right, right, what if we assumed everything they said was a lie? You know, it was like this. We'd have such fun with it because he had all this experience, obviously, of working with addicts who were lying to him. So we'd bring all this experience, and then others would go, oh, come on, that's too extreme. But it just created this real playful feeling that you were in an editing studio almost, trying to find the sort of director's cut on what we thought was going on. And it produced such a creative, sort of investigative feeling. It was so supportive to me bringing the life of my mind into my caring or compassion for people in their situation in my early years. Yeah.
love it. There's lots more I could ask you, but I'm not going to. I'm going to leave it at that. If people want to know more, I invite them to follow your work. And will you be kind of presenting some of this material at some conferences going forward? Just wondering.
I don't know. I don't know about in-person travel at the moment.
Yeah,
I'm certainly going to be offering a series of online presentations. Um, what I am doing for Astrology University on December the 12th is continuing my series on the moon based on in-person workshop in Colorado a few months ago. So I
that will
did,
that will be
yeah,
recorded.
yeah, that'd be
So
recorded. Yeah, so of course, yes. So I'll have done that by the time this comes out. But that's the first two of them done, both of which are recorded, the earthy moon and the watery moon. And then in 2025, I'll do the airy and fiery moon. So a whole take on the moon taken by element. Yes, the recordings of the previous ones are available and they're a lot of fun. We look at the developmental material around the moon. We look at historical examples of those moon placements, but we also try to draw a general thesis about both the nature of the moon and what's going on in those different elements.
fantastic. Well, I'll be going over this again. Lucky me, I got to hear it first. That was fantastic.
Yeah, it was a pleasure to see you and lovely to share with you. And good luck for the
Yeah.
rest of the conference. And yeah, enjoy quantum astrology, folks. Blessings all.